Hi everyone, I'm Ian. You know what I hate? Terrible consoles. So instead of avoiding them forever, I'm going to talk about them so I never have to again.
The year is 1994. Sega is coming off the popularity of the Genesis, but now they have to make a new, better console.
Instead, we got the Sega Saturn.
The Sega Saturn, the start of the downfall of Sega consoles. Sega decided they needed to release a CD-based console. It's actually not bad. The Saturn actually has military flight sim hardware in it, which means that it was the most powerful 3D console on the market. Even computers were about 5 years behind. Here's Sega Rally 1995, and here's the Need for Speed on Panasonic 3DO. Not only that, it also had online services with a modem. One of the weirdest things about the Saturn is it not only has a CD drive, but also has a cartridge slot. You'd think this would be used for maybe backwards compatibility with the Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X. But instead it was just used for expansion cards. There were several reasons that the Saturn failed, due to changes at Sega with the CEO of Sega of America stepping down and third-party relations really slipping. There was also the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, meaning that there wasn't an actual Sonic game released on the Saturn till 1997 with Sonic Jam. But the biggest reason is Sega had to compete with Sony and the PlayStation. With the PlayStation being such a popular console, Sony just couldn't keep up with them. Up next is the Neo Geo, which actually started as an arcade cabinet. SNK was well known for making arcade cabinets, but in 1990, they released the Neo Geo, which brought the arcade to your home.
I don't have space for all that. There's like 20 cabinets.
This sounds great, but that's actually all Sega did with a lot of the Master System and Genesis games. This is where it starts to get bad. The Neo Geo cartridges are massive, about the same size as a DVD case. With this, they were expensive, costing about $200 to $300 per game. This isn't where it ends. The console was $650 when it was first released. Adjusted today, that's $1,500. It also had huge controllers. They were basically just the arcade controls, just cut out and put in your lap. Along with that, most of the games were fighting games, which means there wasn't that much variety. The Sega Genesis Nomad, which was weird. All the Nomad was a Genesis. That was portable. Kind of. You could use the Nomad as a portable, but you had to put a massive battery pack and only got about 2 to 3 hours of playtime from 6 AA batteries. Alternatively, you could just plug it into the wall. Some of the worst parts of the Nomad were the terrible screen, which, although it was color, it was so blurry that you couldn't see anything. It also didn't have any exclusive games. Even though it didn't have any games made just for it, it did start with a huge library of games for a console that was cheaper, better, and could support more players. The Philips CDI. What do you do when your console has no support and all the games suck?
Make it better?
Oh, make 25 models of almost the exact same thing. Now, they weren't all game consoles. CDI is actually a type of CD, standing for Compact Disc Interactive, meaning that many places could use this tech. There were actually a lot of places that used CDI. Doctors' offices, stores, theme parks, and plenty more. Despite this, the gaming uses really flopped. It was the equivalent of DVD menu games, with such interesting games as Connect 4, Math in French, Scrabble but in Swedish, and Go. The only notable games are Link, The Faces of Evil, and Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, what are considered the worst Zelda games. In the end, the CDI just died, and Philips never made another game console. Up next is the Ouya, which was promising when it was first announced. Promising enough that even I bought one. It's an Android TV console, but it's from before most of them were known to be useless. One of the biggest problems with the Ouya is it didn't really have any games made specifically for it. They were all just games made for Android that could run on the Ouya. One of the things that drew a lot of people to it is the fact that you could code and make games directly on it. Other than that, it sucked. The Ouya was very well priced at a whole $99, but it still failed. After Atari had success with the 2600, they tried 2 more consoles, the 5200 and 7800. But after they flopped, they tried something different.
Not really.
The Atari Jaguar, the first 64-bit console. During the bit wars, where console companies were competing to have the highest number of bits in their console, Plenty of people thought that if you had more bits, then your console was better. But Atari proved that wrong. While Nintendo and Sega had 16-bit consoles still, Atari jumped the gun and made a 64-bit console. This is a lie though.
How could they do this?
The Jaguar wasn't actually 64-bit. It instead had two 32-bit CPUs, but they thought that this was good enough. Despite this, that was the entire marketing campaign. Atari had a 64-bit console and everybody else didn't, with the tagline, "Do the math." The Jaguar's biggest problem was that it didn't really have any good games. Seeing as Atari didn't have a mascot like Nintendo and Sega did, they just had a jumble of games. The controller was another weird thing. It's a combination of both NES-style controllers and the Atari 5200's keypad, making it a very outdated design. Due to the failure of the Jaguar, Atari ended up filing for bankruptcy, leading to them being sold to Hasbro. In the late 70s and early 80s, Commodore was a massive name, being one of the first companies to get computers in people's homes at a reasonable price for the time, with the Commodore 64. So when Nintendo and Sega came into the market, more people were getting rid of their Commodore 64s in favor of the competitors, so Commodore had to come up with something. Commodore came up with the Commodore 64 game system, a console version of the C64. This was actually a great idea. With more people moving to consoles, Commodore had to adapt to the market, but that didn't come without its drawbacks. The C64 was released in 1982, while the C64 game system was released in 1990, meaning that it had quite old hardware in it. The market that it came into was also quite oversaturated, with the NES, Sega Master System, and Atari 7800. One of the biggest problems though was the fact that the C64 game system couldn't play all of the C64's games, due to most games needing something to be typed in to start it. Due to poor software support, old hardware, and no need, it ended up flopping. That wasn't Commodore's last try at a game console though. The Commodore Amiga CD32. Couldn't come up with a better name? Commodore did essentially the exact same thing with the CD32 as they did with the C64 game system. They took a computer and made a set-top box that could play games. But unlike the C64 game system, the CD32 could actually be used as a computer with the use of a keyboard, floppy disk drive, and hard drive. There were a few odd choices made by Commodore with the CD32 though. One of the biggest is that it was never released in the US. Only Europe, Australia, Canada, and Brazil. This was actually due to Commodore needing to pay hefty fines to the US government in order to be able to sell their console in the US. The next odd decision was the design of the controller. It's almost a boomerang, or maybe it's upside down? The buttons on it aren't A, B, X, and Y, or even A, B, C, and D, but instead down arrow into line, 3, 1, 2, repeat, and square. The bumpers also aren't L and R, but instead fast forward and rewind. So if you combine the square stop button, the play pause start button, and the fast forward and rewind buttons, you have a whole cassette deck controls. Due to Commodore not being able to sell their stock and facing deadlines with a software company, they ended up having to pay $10 million in fees, leading to their bankruptcy.
When you think of Apple, what do you think? A company that makes computers, phones, and tablets that keep getting more powerful but also smaller? Or maybe a company that doesn't want you to fix your $2,000 computer when it breaks, and instead wants you to buy another one? Whatever you think, you never really think of Apple as a company that makes game consoles. Well, that's exactly what they did with the Pippin.
The Apple Bandai Pippin was a joint venture between Apple and Bandai to make a Macintosh that was designed to play games on your TV. Despite the Pippin not being very popular, there are actually 3 models: the Pippin Atmark, Pippin Atworld, and Cat's Media Pippin KMP2000. A whole 20 games were released for it in the US, which is better than Europe with only 3 games. One of the biggest problems with the Pippin though was the large price tag at $600 or $1,100 today. Due to Apple never really marketing the Pippin, and Steve Jobs returning to Apple in 1997 and getting rid of a lot of projects, the Pippin just ended up dying. When Tiger is talked about, most people think of the bad LCD games, but I'm not talking about that Tiger. That's Tiger Electronics. This is Tiger Telematics, a Swedish company only known for the Gizmondo. But this isn't where the story starts, and oh boy is it weird. 2000, Carl Freer created Eagle Eye Scandinavia, an electronics distribution business in Sweden. In 2002, after doing nothing of note, Eagle Eye Scandinavia merged with Floor Decor, a carpet retailer.
What?
This isn't where it ends. They went on to rename the company Tiger Telematics and tried to take on Sony and Nintendo with the help of Stefan Eriksson, a Swedish video game developer who
was known for crashing his Ferrari in California and being the leader of a crime organization called the Uppsala Mafia before he ever developed the Gizmondo.
This man has had an interesting life. He also raced in the 24 Hours of Le Mans to promote the Gizmondo. Moving away from the interesting life of Stefan Eriksson, the Gizmondo was released in 2005, meaning that they were competing with the Nintendo DS and the Sony PSP. The weirdest thing about the Gizmondo was the fact it was only ever sold at kiosks in malls, never in actual stores. The Gizmondo was also very expensive. $400 for an ad-free version, and $229 for an ad-enabled version, though there was almost no advertising for the actual console. The Gizmondo ended up dying after the company was investigated of fraud, the company lawyer was arrested for false accounting and tax evasion and was deported back to Denmark, and the founder of Tiger Telematics was arrested after impersonating a police officer.
What?
Up next is the PlayStation TV, which is odd. The PS TV is actually a PS Vita, but it's meant to be hooked up to a TV as the name implies. There's not much interesting about this. The biggest things are that even though it's called the PS TV, you can't use stuff like Netflix and YouTube. You know, things a regular TV could do. You also couldn't play some of the PS Vita's games due to not having a front or back touch. One of the big reasons that most people bought a PS TV was to take with them while traveling, and to use to stream PS3 games to it. Last but not least is the Neo Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color. Problems with the Neo Geo Pocket are that it only has a monochrome screen, which was later revised with the Pocket Color. It also had a whole 9 games, and it was never released in the US. The Pocket Color, on the other hand, was actually released in the US, and it had a lot more games than the regular Pocket, 73 total, but only 31 of those were released in the US. The biggest problem for the Pocket and the Pocket Color are they had to compete with the Game Boy Color, which, although the Pocket Color was cheaper than the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy had a much larger library filled with more recognizable games.
In the end, most of these consoles were just lame. Bad support and bad prices riddled most of them. Although most of these consoles were forgotten, there are some that are still loved by people.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking. Want to keep up with what I'm doing? Consider subscribing as it helps me out a lot. Have any suggestions for videos? Leave a comment.